The clock on the wall showed 11:30 p.m. when David pushed his cleaning cart through the heavy doors of the Grand Opera Theater. The same routine night after night for the past 3 years. While most people were getting ready for bed, his workday was just beginning. The theater felt different at night. During the day, it buzzed with energy. Singers practiced their high notes, musicians tuned their instruments, and directors shouted instructions. But now, in the quiet darkness, it was just David and the empty seats that stretched up toward the ceiling like a giant mouth. He flipped on the work lights, and the stage came alive with a soft glow. There it was, waiting for him like an old friend, the beautiful black piano that sat right in the center. Every night he cleaned around it, dusted its shiny surface, and made sure not a single fingerprint remained on its perfect finish. Most people saw David as just another cleaner. He wore the same blue uniform every day, carried the same supplies, and kept to himself. The singers and musicians barely noticed him as they rushed past, too busy thinking about their performances to pay attention to the quiet man who kept their world spotless. But David had a secret that nobody knew about. As he began his nightly cleaning routine, starting with the seats in the front row, his mind wandered to the rehearsal he had watched earlier that day. He always tried to finish his lunch break near the stage door so he could catch a few minutes of practice time. Today, the lead pianist had been working on a piece from an upcoming show. The music was so beautiful it made David's chest feel tight with emotion. He moved methodically through his tasks, emptying trash bins, wiping down armrests, checking for lost items under seats. A forgotten program here, a dropped earring there. People left behind pieces of their evening, and David collected them all, turning them into the lost and found office each morning before heading home. The truth was, David understood every note that floated through these halls. He had grown up in a small town where his grandmother taught piano lessons in her living room. From the time he could barely reach the keys, she had shown him how to find the music hiding inside the black and white squares. But life had taken him in different directions. Bills needed paying, family needed help, and dreams of music school felt like wishes written in the wind. When he first got the job at the Grand Opera Theater, he thought it might kill him to be so close to music but never able to touch it. The first few weeks were torture. He would clean around that beautiful piano, knowing exactly what songs lived inside it, but never daring to press a single key. Then one night, about 6 months into the job, something changed. He had been working later than usual, trying to get the theater ready for a special event the next day. The building was completely empty. Even the security guard was making his rounds on the upper floors. David found himself standing next to the piano, his cleaning cloth forgotten in his hand. His fingers moved toward the keys almost by themselves. Just one note, he told himself. Nobody would hear. Nobody would know. The sound that came out was pure magic. It echoed through the empty theater like a prayer. Before he knew it, one note became 2, then 3. Then a simple melody his grandmother had taught him when he was 7 years old. That was the beginning of his real education. Night after night. When his official cleaning was done, David would sit at that piano and teach himself the pieces he heard during the day. He had a good ear, better than good, actually. He could hear a song once during rehearsal and play it back that same evening, finding the right keys by feel and memory. At first, he was terrified someone would catch him. He would play very softly, barely pressing the keys, ready to jump up and grab his cleaning supplies at the first sound of footsteps. But weeks passed, then months, and nobody ever came to check on him during those late hours. His confidence grew. He started playing louder, letting his fingers dance across the keys the way they wanted to. He learned the dramatic pieces from the operas, the gentle songs from the smaller shows. Even some of the warm-up exercises he heard the professional pianists practicing. The piano became his teacher, his friend, his escape from a life that often felt too small for the music living inside his heart. During the day, he was invisible David the cleaner, but at night, alone on that stage, he became someone else entirely. He learned to use the foot pedals to make the sound rich and full. He discovered which keys sang the loudest and which ones whispered like secrets. Most importantly, he learned to put his emotions into the music, just like his grandmother had taught him all those years ago. The other theater workers knew David was reliable and quiet, but they had no idea about his growing skill. When they saw him wheeling his cart around during the day, they never imagined that those same hands had been making beautiful music just hours before. The singers who barely glanced at him had no clue that he knew their songs better than they did. Some nights, David would stand in the back of the theater during rehearsals, pretending to clean the same spot over and over while he memorized new pieces. The musicians on stage were good. Some of them were excellent, but David could hear things they missed. Little places where the emotion could be stronger, where the timing could be more perfect, where the music was asking for something different than what it was getting. He never said anything, of course. Who was he to have opinions about music? He was just the guy who emptied the trash cans. But in his heart, David knew he had become something more. Every night spent with that piano had changed him. The music that had been sleeping inside him for years was finally awake. His fingers were strong and sure now. His understanding of rhythm and melody had grown deep and true. The problem was that nobody else knew any of this was happening. As David finished cleaning the theater that night, he looked at the piano one more time before turning off the stage lights. Tomorrow there would be another rehearsal, another show, another chance for him to listen and learn. In a few hours, when the building was truly quiet, he would be back here again, sitting at those familiar keys, playing music that no one else would ever hear. He had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that his secret talent, hidden away in these quiet midnight hours, was about to be discovered in the most unexpected way possible, that the skills he had been developing in private were about to thrust him into a spotlight brighter than any he had ever imagined. For now, though he was just David the cleaner, pushing his cart toward the exit, whistling softly under his breath as he locked up another night at the Grand Opera Theater, the piano sat silent and waiting in the darkness, holding all the music they had shared together, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Tuesday morning started like any other day at the Grand Opera Theater. David arrived at 6 a.m. for his regular shift, 2 hours before the evening crew would take over. The building felt different in the morning light, busier, more urgent. Today was special, though nobody had bothered to tell the cleaning staff just how special it really was. The theater was preparing for the opening night of their biggest show of the year. Months of planning had led to this moment. Ticket sales had broken records. People had flown in from other countries just to be there. The local newspapers had been writing about it for weeks. David noticed the extra activity right away. There were more people than usual rushing around with clipboards and worried expressions. Delivery trucks kept pulling up to load expensive costumes and props. The flower arrangements for the lobby were twice as big as normal. He went about his morning routine, but something felt off. The singers seemed more nervous during their warm-ups. The stage director was pacing back and forth, checking his watch every few minutes. Even the security guards looked tense. Around 10 a.m., David was cleaning the backstage area when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "Have you heard from Antonio yet?" One of the assistant directors was asking. Still nothing. His phone goes straight to voicemail. His wife said he left the hotel this morning for breakfast, but that was 3 hours ago. David knew who Antonio was. Everyone at the theater knew. He was the lead pianist, the musical heart of tonight's performance. A man in his 60s with silver hair and hands that could make the piano sing like a choir of angels. David had watched him rehearse countless times, studying every move, every expression, every way he touched the keys. "Maybe he's just running late," the other person suggested, but David could hear the worry in their voice. Antonio is never late. Never. Something's wrong. David tried to focus on his cleaning, but the conversation had planted a seed of concern in his mind. As the morning wore on, that seed grew into something bigger. More people were asking about Antonio. Phone calls were being made. The theater manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, was walking around with a face that looked like storm clouds. By noon, the truth was impossible to hide. Antonio had collapsed at a restaurant downtown. Food poisoning, the doctor said. Severe enough to put him in the hospital. There was no way he would be performing tonight. David watched from the shadows as panic began to spread through the theater like wildfire. Assistant directors huddled in corners, making frantic phone calls. Someone mentioned the understudy pianist, but apparently he was stuck at the airport in another city because of flight delays. "What about local musicians?" someone suggested. "Surely there's someone in the city who could step in." Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head grimly. "Everyone good enough is either already booked tonight or out of town. I've called every music school, every concert hall, every piano teacher I can think of. It's like the entire city's piano players vanished into thin air. David's heart was racing as he pretended to dust the same spot on the wall for the 5th time. He wanted to speak up, to say something, but the words felt stuck in his throat. What would he even say? That the janitor could play piano? They would laugh at him, or worse, they might think he was making fun of their crisis. The afternoon brought more bad news. The flight delays were getting worse. Weather was keeping planes grounded all along the East Coast. The understudy wouldn't make it in time, and neither would any of the emergency pianists they had tried to contact from other cities. David finished his shift at 2 p.m., but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He lingered in the break room, then found excuses to walk past the main office where he could hear snippets of increasingly desperate conversations. "We might have to cancel," he heard Mrs. Rodriguez saying to someone on the phone. "Do you have any idea what that means?" "The money we'll lose? The reputation damage. Some of these people have traveled across the country to be here tonight." The weight of the situation was crushing. David had cleaned this theater for 3 years. He had seen how hard everyone worked to put on these shows. The singers practiced until their voices were raw. The costume designers stayed up all night fixing tiny details. The lighting crew ran through their sequences dozens of times to get everything perfect, and now it might all be for nothing because of one missing pianist. David found himself standing outside the main theater doors, staring at the beautiful posters advertising tonight's show. In just 6 hours, thousands of people would start arriving. They would be dressed in their finest clothes, excited for an evening of world-class music. Many of them had probably been planning this night for months. He thought about all those midnight hours he had spent at the piano. All those songs he had learned note by note, playing them over and over until his fingers knew them by heart. He thought about his grandmother, who had always told him that music wasn't meant to be kept locked away inside one person. "Music is meant to be shared, David," she used to say. "It's meant to bring joy to people who need it." But this was different. This wasn't his grandmother's living room with a few neighbors listening. This was the Grand Opera Theater, with professional singers and an audience that expected perfection. These people paid good money to hear the best musicians in the world, not some janitor who had taught himself to play in secret. Still, as David stood there watching the chaos unfold around him, a thought kept growing stronger in his mind. He knew every piece in tonight's program. He had been listening to the rehearsals for weeks. He had practiced many of these songs on the very piano that would be used tonight. The question wasn't whether he could play the music. The question was whether he had the courage to step forward when everything was falling apart. At 4 p.m., David made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going home like he was supposed to, he walked back into the theater. He found Mrs. Rodriguez in her office, surrounded by papers and looking like she hadn't slept in days. She looked up when he knocked on the door frame. "David, shouldn't you be heading home?" "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something." She gestured for him to sit down, probably assuming he wanted to report a maintenance issue or ask about his schedule. David perched on the edge of the chair, his heart hammering so hard he was sure she could hear it. "It's about tonight," he began, then stopped. "How do you tell someone that you might be the solution to their biggest nightmare?" "What about tonight?" she asked, distracted by another ringing phone. David took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "I think I can help with the piano problem." Mrs. Rodriguez stopped reaching for the phone and looked at him with confusion. "Help how?" "David, I appreciate the thought, but unless you know a professional pianist, we haven't thought of job. I'm a pianist," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that couldn't be crossed. Mrs. Rodriguez stared at him with an expression that was part confusion, part disbelief, and part desperate hope. "David," she said slowly, "what exactly are you telling me?" Mrs. Rodriguez stared at David for what felt like forever. Her eyes searched his face, looking for any sign that he might be joking, or that she had misunderstood what he just said. The silence stretched between them until David wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. "You play piano," she said finally, not really asking but trying to make sense of what she had heard. "Yes, ma'am. I've been playing for most of my life. I know all the pieces for tonight's show." Mrs. Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair. "David, I need you to understand something. This isn't a church recital or a community center talent show. This is opening night at one of the most respected opera theaters in the country. We have critics coming from major newspapers. Some of our donors have flown in from Europe just for this performance. I understand, David said, though his voice was shaking slightly. The pianist needs to accompany professional opera singers who have trained their entire lives for moments like this. The timing has to be perfect. The music has to support voices that can fill this entire theater without microphones. One wrong note, one missed cue, and the whole performance falls apart. David nodded, feeling smaller with every word she spoke. Maybe this was crazy. Maybe he was being foolish to think he could step into Antonio's shoes. But then Mrs. Rodriguez did something unexpected. She stood up and walked around her desk until she was standing right in front of him. "Tell me how you learned to play," she said, her voice softer now. So David told her about his grandmother, about the piano lessons in that small living room, about losing touch with music when life got complicated. He told her about discovering that he could learn songs just by listening to them, about the midnight hours he had been spending at the theater's piano for the past 2.5 years. "You've been playing our piano?" she asked, and David's heart sank. He was probably about to get fired on top of everything else. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I know I shouldn't have. I couldn't help myself. The music was so beautiful, and I wanted to learn it so badly. I was always very careful not to damage anything, and I always made sure I was alone." Mrs. Rodriguez held up a hand to stop him. "David, I'm not angry. I'm just surprised. In 3 years of working here, you never mentioned that you could play piano." "Nobody ever asked," he said simply, "and honestly, I didn't think anyone would believe me." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. David could almost see her weighing the impossible situation. On one side was the risk of putting an untrained janitor on stage in front of thousands of people. On the other side was canceling the biggest show of the year and disappointing everyone who had worked so hard to make it happen. "I need to hear you play," she said suddenly. "Now?" David asked. "Right now. If there's even a small chance you could save tonight's performance, I have to know." They walked together through the empty theater toward the stage. David's legs felt wobbly and his hands were sweating. This was it. This was the moment when his secret would either open a door or close it forever. The stage piano looked bigger and more intimidating than it ever had during his midnight practice sessions. Under the bright work lights, with Mrs. Rodriguez watching him closely, it felt like the whole world was staring at him. "What would you like me to play?" he asked. "Start with the opening piece from tonight's program," she said. "If you really know it as well as you claim, that should be easy enough." David sat down at the piano bench and positioned his hands over the keys. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for just a moment, and began to play. The first notes floated through the empty theater like birds taking flight. David's nervousness started to melt away as his fingers found their familiar places on the keyboard. This was the song he had practiced more than any other, the piece that had made him fall in love with the entire show. As he played, he could feel Mrs. Rodriguez's surprise even without looking at her. His hands moved with confidence across the keys, finding every delicate melody, every powerful crescendo, every gentle whisper of sound that the piece required. But David didn't stop with just the opening. Without being asked, he flowed seamlessly into the next piece, then the next. Song after song from tonight's program poured out of the piano, each one more beautiful than the last. He played with the kind of passion that can't be taught in music schools. Every note carried emotion that came from years of hidden dreams and quiet longing. His interpretation of the familiar pieces was fresh and heartfelt, bringing new life to songs that the theater staff had heard hundreds of times during rehearsals. When he finally stopped playing, the silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of disbelief or confusion. It was the silence that comes after witnessing something truly special. Mrs. Rodriguez was standing with her mouth slightly open, staring at David like she was seeing him for the first time. "How long were you planning to keep this a secret?" she asked softly. "Forever, I guess," David admitted. "I never imagined a situation like this would come up." Before Mrs. Rodriguez could respond, they heard footsteps coming from the back of the theater. Dr. Williams, the music director, appeared at the edge of the stage looking frazzled and exhausted. "Maria, please tell me you have some good news," he called out. "The box office is getting calls from people asking if tonight's show is still happening. Word is starting to spread that Antonio is in the hospital." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at David, then at Dr. Williams, then back at David again. "Robert, I need you to listen to something," she said. Dr. Williams walked closer to the stage, squinting up at them in confusion. "Maria, we don't have time for—" "Just listen," she said firmly. "David, would you play that opening piece one more time?" David's heart was pounding again, but he nodded and placed his hands back on the keys. This time, knowing that the music director was listening, he poured everything he had into the performance. Every lesson his grandmother had taught him, every midnight hour of practice, every emotion he had kept locked inside for years. The music filled the theater with such beauty that Dr. Williams stopped walking and stood perfectly still. His expression changed from impatience to curiosity to amazement, to something that looked almost like disbelief. When David finished, Dr. Williams was quiet for a long time. "Who is this?" he asked Mrs. Rodriguez, though his eyes never left David. "This is David Chen, one of our custodial staff," she said, "and apparently he's also a pianist." Dr. Williams climbed the steps onto the stage and walked over to the piano. He looked at David closely, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. "How long have you been playing?" he asked. "About 25 years, David answered. "Where did you study?" "My grandmother taught me when I was young. The rest I learned on my own." Dr. Williams turned to Mrs. Rodriguez with an expression that was part excitement and part terror. "Maria," he said slowly, "I think we might have just found our pianist." The next few hours passed like a whirlwind that David could barely keep up with. One minute he was a janitor mopping floors, and the next he was being rushed to the wardrobe department to find a tuxedo that would fit him for tonight's performance. "Try this one," said Janet, the head costume designer, holding up a black jacket. "Antonio is taller than you, but maybe we can make it work." David slipped on the jacket. The sleeves were too long, hanging past his fingertips, and the shoulders were so wide he looked like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. "No good," Janet muttered, tossing the jacket aside. "What about this one?" They went through 6 different tuxedos before finding one that came close to fitting. Even then, Janet had to pin and tuck several places while David stood perfectly still, trying not to move. "This is crazy," he whispered to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was watching the whole process with a mixture of hope and panic in her eyes. "I know," she whispered back, "but it's the kind of crazy that might just work." While Janet worked on the costume, Dr. Williams was making phone calls to the lead singers, explaining the situation. David could hear pieces of the conversations from across the room. "I know this is unusual. Yes, he's never performed professionally before. No, I can't guarantee anything, but I've heard him play and he's remarkable." Each phone call seemed to take forever. David imagined the singers on the other end, probably wondering if the music director had lost his mind. How do you tell someone that their accompanist for the most important night of the season is going to be the guy who usually empties their dressing room trash cans? At 5:30, with just 2.5 hours until curtain time, Dr. Williams gathered everyone in the rehearsal room for an emergency meeting. The lead singers were there, looking worried and confused. The stage crew was there, checking their watches nervously. Even some of the board members had shown up, having heard whispers that something unusual was happening. "I know you all have questions," Dr. Williams began. "The situation is not ideal, but we're going to make the best of it. David, would you like to introduce yourself?" All eyes turned to David, who felt like he might faint. These were people he had admired from a distance for years. The soprano, Catherine Blake, had a voice that could make grown men cry. The baritone, Thomas Park, had performed at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Now they were all staring at him, waiting to see if he could possibly fill Antonio's shoes. "I'm David Chen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working here for 3 years as part of the custodial staff. I know this is strange, but I promise I know the music. I've been listening to your rehearsals and practicing on my own time." Catherine raised her hand slightly. "David, no offense, but this is opening night. We've been preparing for months. The timing between the piano and vocals has to be absolutely perfect. If you've never worked with opera singers before..." "I understand," David said. "Maybe we could do a quick run-through of a few pieces, just so you can see how it feels." Dr. Williams nodded. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Catherine, let's start with your opening aria. Take it slow at first." David sat down at the rehearsal piano, which was smaller than the grand piano on stage but had the same feel under his fingers. He looked up at Catherine, waiting for her cue. She began to sing, and David followed her lead. At first he played cautiously, listening carefully to her voice and matching her tempo, but as the piece progressed, something magical began to happen. David's playing seemed to lift Catherine's voice, supporting it in ways that brought out colors and emotions she hadn't expected. When they finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "Again," Catherine said, but this time her voice held a note of curiosity rather than skepticism. They ran through the piece a second time and then a third. Each time, David's confidence grew, and each time, Catherine seemed more impressed with how well he anticipated her musical choices. Thomas stepped forward for his turn. His deep baritone voice filled the small rehearsal room as David accompanied him through one of the evening's most challenging pieces. Again, the chemistry between pianist and singer was undeniable. "Where did you learn to follow a singer like that?" Thomas asked when they finished. "I've been watching you rehearse for months," David admitted. "I know how you like to take your time with certain phrases, how you build up to the big moments. I guess I've been studying without realizing it." Dr. Williams looked at his watch. "We need to move this to the main stage. The acoustics are different there, and David needs to get used to the bigger piano." The group moved through the theater to the main stage, where the evening's performance would take place in just over 2 hours. The stage lights were already set, casting dramatic shadows across the elegant set pieces. The grand piano sat in its usual spot, polished and ready. David walked over to the piano and ran his fingers lightly across the keys. This was the same instrument he had been playing secretly for over 2 years, but tonight it would be heard by more than 2,000 people. "Let's run through the first act," Dr. Williams suggested. "Just the major pieces so everyone can get comfortable." What happened next was something that none of them had expected. As they worked through the music together, David didn't just accompany the singers, he elevated them. His playing brought out new depths in their performances. He seemed to understand instinctively when to push forward and when to pull back, when to let a singer shine alone, and when to join them in musical conversation. Catherine found herself singing with more passion than she had in weeks of rehearsals. Thomas discovered new emotional layers in songs he had performed dozens of times. Even the smaller supporting roles seemed to come alive with David's sensitive accompaniment. "This is incredible," whispered one of the board members to Mrs. Rodriguez. "How long has he been hiding this talent?" By 7 p.m., with 1 hour until showtime, something unexpected had happened. The panic and worry that had filled the theater all day had transformed into excitement. The singers were actually looking forward to performing with David. The crew members who had stopped to listen during the rehearsal were spreading word that something special was about to happen. Dr. Williams pulled David aside as the singers went to get into their costumes. "How are you feeling?" he asked. David was quiet for a moment, thinking about the question. "Scared," he said honestly, "but also ready. I've been waiting my whole life for a chance like this, even though I never knew it." "The singers love working with you," Dr. Williams said. "That's not easy to achieve, especially under these circumstances. You have a gift, David. Tonight is just the beginning." As David headed to the small dressing room that had been hastily prepared for him, he could hear the audience beginning to arrive. Voices and laughter echoed through the lobby as people found their seats. In less than an hour, the curtain would rise and David's secret would become the most public thing he had ever done. He sat down in front of the mirror and looked at himself in the borrowed tuxedo. The man staring back looked like a pianist. He looked like someone who belonged on that stage. For the first time all day, David smiled. Whatever happened next, he was ready. At 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes before curtain time, David stood in the wings watching the audience settle into their seats. Through a gap in the heavy curtains, he could see row after row of people dressed in their finest clothes. Some were studying their programs. Others were chatting quietly with their companions. None of them had any idea that the person who would be playing piano for them tonight was the same man who had been cleaning their seats just that morning. His hands were shaking slightly, so he pressed them together and took a deep breath. In all his midnight practice sessions, he had never imagined this moment. The theater was completely sold out. Every seat was filled from the front row all the way up to the highest balcony. 5 minutes to places, came the announcement over the backstage speakers. Catherine appeared beside him, looking stunning in her elaborate costume. Her hair was pinned up with jeweled clips that sparkled under the stage lights, and her dress flowed around her like something from a fairy tale. "How are you doing?" she asked softly. "Terrified," David admitted with a weak smile. "Good," she said, surprising him. "That means you care." The best performers are always a little scared before they go on. It keeps you sharp. Thomas joined them, looking equally magnificent in his period costume. "Remember what we talked about during rehearsal," he said to David. "Trust your instincts. You've got this." Dr. Williams appeared, headset around his neck, clipboard in hand. "David, it's time. This was it." David walked to the edge of the stage where the grand piano waited for him. The curtain was still down, but he could hear the audience on the other side. Thousands of people who had paid good money and taken time out of their lives to be here tonight. He sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly, just like he had done hundreds of times during his secret practice sessions. But this time felt different. This time the music he made would matter to people he had never met. The stage lights dimmed to black. David heard the rustle of programs being closed, the whisper of conversations ending, the settling sound of an audience ready to be transported. Curtain going up, came the quiet announcement in his earpiece. The heavy curtain began to rise slowly, revealing the beautiful set that the crew had worked so hard to perfect. As the lights came up on stage, David saw something that took his breath away. The entire audience was there, looking at him with expectation and excitement. For just a moment he felt frozen. These people had no idea who he was or why he was sitting at the piano instead of Antonio. But then he remembered something his grandmother used to tell him. "The audience doesn't come to see you fail, David. They come hoping you'll take them somewhere beautiful." David placed his fingers on the keys and began to play the opening notes of the evening's first piece. The sound that came from the piano was rich and clear, filling every corner of the theater. As the familiar melody flowed from his hands, he felt his nervousness start to transform into something else. Pure joy. Catherine entered from stage left, and as she began to sing, David felt the magic happen. Her voice soared above his accompaniment like a bird riding the wind. Every note he played seemed to give her voice more power, more emotion, more beauty. The audience was completely captivated. David could feel their attention like a physical presence, but instead of making him more nervous, it energized him. These people had come looking for something special, and he was helping to give it to them. As the first act progressed, David found himself doing something he had never expected. He wasn't just playing the music exactly as he had practiced it. He was responding to the singers, to the audience, even to the energy in the room. When Catherine held a high note a little longer than usual, he held his chord to support her. When Thomas wanted to build more drama in a particular phrase, David was right there with him, adding power to the moment. During the intermission, David stayed at the piano while the audience filed out to the lobby. He could hear pieces of their conversations floating back to him. "The pianist is incredible tonight. Is that still Antonio? I don't think so. This sounds different, more passionate somehow. Whoever it is, they're making the singers sound better than I've ever heard them." Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at his side. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," David said. And he meant it. The second act was even better than the first. David felt like he was having a conversation with the music itself. Every song became a dialogue between his piano and the singers' voices. The audience was so quiet during the tender moments that David could hear people breathing. During the dramatic climaxes, he could feel their excitement like electricity in the air. There was one moment near the end of the show when everything came together perfectly. Thomas was singing the evening's most challenging aria, a piece that required both power and delicate emotion. David's accompaniment seemed to lift the singer's voice to heights that surprised even Thomas himself. The combination of piano and voice created something that was more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. As the final notes of the evening faded away, the theater fell into that special silence that only happens after something truly remarkable. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. David sat at the piano with his hands still on the keys, hardly believing what had just happened. Then the applause began. It started as a rumble in the back of the theater and grew into a roar that seemed to shake the building. People weren't just clapping. They were on their feet, cheering, calling out their appreciation. David had never heard anything like it. Catherine and Thomas came over to the piano and each took one of his hands, raising them high in the air. The three of them bowed together as the audience continued to cheer. David looked out at all those faces that were smiling, some with tears in their eyes, all of them sharing in the magic that had just happened. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Williams announced from the side of the stage, Tonight you heard the remarkable piano artistry of David Chen, who stepped in at the last moment to save our performance. This was his professional debut. The applause somehow got even louder. David saw people in the front rows wiping their eyes, others holding their hands over their hearts. He had given them something beautiful, something they would remember for the rest of their lives. As the curtain finally came down, David was surrounded by the cast and crew, all of them talking at once, congratulating him, asking him questions about his background. But through all the excitement, he could still hear the audience outside, still clapping, still cheering. Mrs. Rodriguez fought her way through the crowd to reach him. "David," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you just saved our entire season. But more than that, you gave those people something they'll never forget." David looked around at all the faces surrounding him, colleagues who this morning had seen him as just the quiet janitor, and who now saw him as the musician he had always been inside. For the first time in his life, his secret was out in the open, and it was more beautiful than he ever could have imagined.